The message came at 6:14 p.m., a blurry photo in the old Carrington and Flint project group chat. Found the program, someone wrote beneath it. The image showed the printed agenda for the gala, each line in serif font, each awardee neatly listed. I wasn't looking for my name. I already knew better. But there it was. Fifth line from the bottom, Cassandra Hale Lifetime Recognition. And over it, a thick slash of black ink. Not erased, not replaced, just crossed out. I stared at the screen for a long time. No explanation, no follow-up, no new message saying it was an error. I typed something, then deleted it. I closed the app. The navy dress I'd ironed that morning still hung on the hallway door, catching shadows from the apartment window. I'd bought it 10 years ago when we closed the Zorath deal in Zurich, wore it on stage. Back then, Gregory called me the anchor of the firm. He said it in front of clients, in front of my team. Tonight, I wore it alone. I reheated soup I had no appetite for. The apartment was quiet, but not peaceful, more like waiting room quiet, the kind that presses in on your ribs. I glanced at the bookshelf while I ate awards plaques, a framed headline from the day we broke 1B in contracted revenue. I remembered how cold the stage floor was that night, how bright the lights had felt. No invite ever came for this year's gala, no RSVP email, no calendar hold. I rinsed the bowl, wiped the counter, turned the hallway light off. Sat at my desk, opened the final contract folder for the Marlowe account. Every clause intact, every escalation tracked. The deal was still pending final authentication, the final layer untouched. I clicked into the back-end architecture and scrolled down until I saw the clause I'd written 6 months earlier. Clause 46.7b, execution requires biometric match from origin terminal and signature profile. I didn't smile. I just shut the screen and powered off the monitor. Then I turned toward the window and sat quietly while the city lit up below me. I arrived early the next morning, partly out of habit, partly because I didn't want to walk into stairs. Or worse, polite silence. The elevator opened to the executive floor, and the first thing I saw was the rotating digital signage near reception. It was already looping images from last night's gala gold lighting, soft jazz champagne glasses lifted in air. Then came the faces, Gregory, Flint in tuxedo, a cluster of board members mid-toast, and finally a solo photo of Brielle Langdon on stagehands, clasped, head tilted in that polished, deliberate way media trainers teach. The screen caption read, Brielle Langdon leads the 50 Mippo Marlowe initiative into finalization. Leads. I walked to my office, though I already knew. When I opened my inbox, the press release was sitting unread company-wide. We're proud to recognize Brielle Langdon's bold leadership and strategic instinct in accelerating the Marlowe Group partnership. Her vision represents the next era of Carrington and Flint. My name wasn't mentioned, not once. But what caught my breath was the attachment. The press kit included a polished PDF and excerpt from the internal memo summarizing the compliance model I'd designed. I recognized every paragraph, every line. I'd written it during a layover in Dulles 6 weeks ago, scribbling clause logic in the margins of a boarding pass. They had reformatted it centered, the headers changed the font, but the core remained mine. And the byline now read, Prepared by Strategic Ventures, Langdon Office. I sat back in my chair and let the silence close in. Outside my glass wall, a few employees passed by with coffee. No one looked in. No one knocked. I opened the shared server out of muscle memory, searched the Marlowe archive. My voice logs were still there, hidden in the audit trail. So were the draft timestamps. They hadn't deleted me, just covered me in someone else's paint. I copied one folder to an encrypted drive and closed the server tab. Then I picked up the framed project timeline on my shelf and turned it face down. I wouldn't need it anymore. 5 years ago, I rewrote Clause 9 of the Petrovic Aerospace contract on a red-eye flight from Boston to Denver. We were 48 hours from breach with $12 million on the line and a vendor lawsuit hovering in draft. Legal had flagged the original indemnity terms as ambiguous. My director at the time, Edward Falk, had promised the client something we couldn't deliver, and somehow that burden landed on my desk. The flight was half empty. I sat in 22C with a printout balanced on my knees and a dry chicken wrap going cold on the tray table. By the time we landed, the clause was tighter, cleaner, legally sound, and ready for client review. I remember sending the draft to Edward from the airport lounge at 5:42 a.m. No reply, just silence. The next day, Carrington held a press call announcing a resolution crafted under the direct supervision of Edward Falk. He was quoted in an industry feature the following week. When the heat came, we met it head-on with clarity and responsiveness. We. That word burned more than anything else. I didn't speak up. I told myself the work mattered more than the credit, that the client's trust meant more than my name in a memo. I went back to my office, reviewed vendor payment schedules, and moved on. But it stuck. Not the insult, those fade. What lingered was the quiet part. The way everyone looked the other way, how no one corrected the record, how even the junior associates stopped referencing my notes as mine. That wasn't the last time. 3 deals later, I watched another VP polish a pitch deck, using my projections without a single mention of my role. A year after that, I trained a team that later called themselves self-led. Each time I stayed silent. Each time I believed it would balance out, that the long view would reward the work. But now, staring at the screen where Brielle's name sat above my memo, I realized something cold and sharp. It had never been an accident. It was a pattern, a system, a design, and I was done feeding it. 6 months ago, a breach alert hit our system just past midnight. A 0-day exploit had slipped through a vendor-side tunnel, reaching the finance back end before it was flagged and contained. It never made the news. Gregory called it a routine inconvenience in the next board meeting, but I knew better. What shook me wasn't how deep it got, but how easily it could have touched the Marlowe draft. The following morning, I walked into my office with a cup of black coffee and rewrote the contract architecture from the inside out. No drama, no email chain, just a line of code buried deep inside the final integration packet. Clause 46.7b wasn't part of any pitch deck. It didn't show up in board summaries or compliance overviews. It was a conditional execution clause. Final authorization of the contract required 3 inputs: voice print match, geolocation sync, and terminal ID confirmation. In plain terms, it meant the deal couldn't close unless I signed it from my machine in my office using my voice. I didn't do it out of ego. I did it because the stakes were too high. The Marlowe agreement wasn't just a signature. It was 12 months of layered procurement strategy, 6 cross-border compliance gates, and 5 legal rewrites. If someone tampered with even one word, the liability cascade would hit like a hammer. And no one in that building, certainly not Brielle Langdon, understood how close we'd come to collapse when the satellite clause nearly conflicted with U.S. export controls. I filed the biometric clause under a quiet subfolder labeled final.origin.signature, required then, encrypted the trail twice, and saved a copy to my personal archive. No one asked about it. No one even noticed. They were too busy polishing quarterly decks and setting up gala invites. But I slept better that night than I had in weeks, because even then I sensed the winds shifting. And now, watching Brielle posture for press coverage with my language in her mouth, I didn't feel rage. I felt precision, the kind that tightens, not explodes. I opened the secure drive. The clause was still there, waiting, just like I designed it to. I didn't plan to watch the interview. I had the tab open for 3 hours before I finally clicked play. Forbes Tech had released a glowing feature that morning, the Gen Z visionary reshaping defense procurement. Brielle Langdon's face filled the thumbnail, all clean lines, sharp eyes and calculated posture, arms folded just enough to signal power, but relaxed enough to feel marketable. The video opened with a sweeping shot of Carrington's headquarters and dissolved into her sitting across from a tech reporter, smile-wide voice polished. She started with fluff, Something about innovation cycles and lean processes. Then came the part that made me still. This deal really came down to intuition and agility, she said. I knew we had to move faster, take bolder steps. That's when I made the call to accelerate the Marlowe contract. Marlowe. She mispronounced the name. Constella Marlowe had been the client for nearly a year. I had been on calls with their legal team across 3 time zones. I'd stood in line at security checkpoints with their CFO. I'd walked their plant floors in safety boots and hairnets. Marlowe, not Marlowe. But the reporter didn't correct her. Just nodded and smiled, typing notes that would likely show up in a flattering caption later. I watched in silence as Brielle continued talking, claiming she restructured the final negotiation timeline for maximum responsiveness, even though she hadn't been in the room when we drafted the contingency model. She hadn't seen the first panic email from Marlowe's internal counsel. She didn't even know the fallback clause name. Still, the comments flooded in inspiring leadership. Finally, a new generation in government contracts. Brielle is the future. I scrolled slowly, not expecting anything different, but buried midway down the thread just above a string of rocket emojis, I saw it. Didn't this originate under Cassandra Hale's team last quarter? No replies, no likes, just a question. Plain. Inconvenient. True. I stared at it for a while. I didn't click anything. I didn't add my name. But for a brief moment, the current paused, and someone else somewhere remembered how this all began. I closed the tab and reopened the archive. Something told me the clause might be needed sooner than I thought. The message came through Signal, not email. That alone told me something was off. Jacob Sorrell. Hey, sorry to bother you. Are you around? Jacob had been one of the quiet ones, sharp, precise, a little too careful for his own good. He shadowed me on the Marlowe integration last summer, always asking about why I coded redundancies the way I did instead of just how. That told me he paid attention. Me, I'm here. What's going on? The typing bubble blinked for a few seconds. Then a longer message appeared. Jacob. They're trying to push the final execution through Gateway Final. It's rejecting all inputs. I didn't even know there was a security clause like this embedded, but it keeps flagging authentication source mismatch, origin terminal required. I leaned back, absorbing the words like an old song I'd forgotten I wrote. So they had reached the final layer. Good. I pulled up the remote mirror of my archive and confirmed the flag was active. Clause 46.7b had triggered its first wall. The biometric lock was holding. Jacob, they're escalating. Brielle is not happy. Neither is Gregory. I imagined the two of them standing over a conference room table. Red-faced voices clipped blaming systems and passwords and legacy over engineering without understanding that what they called a hurdle was the very thing that protected them from legal implosion. Me, did you check the contract draft itself? Jacob, we only have the final PDF, not the original versions you handled. I paused, then typed slowly, me, check page 14, footnote 3. I knew what was there. The biometric clause was referenced discreetly, a technical field marker that seemed like boilerplate, unless you knew where to look. He read the message, no reply. But 3 minutes later, my mirrored log showed someone had attempted to access the terminal certificate index. Then again. Then failed. The system wasn't budging, and it wasn't going to. I closed the archive and muted my phone, let them stare at screens and curse firewalls. The code was doing its job. It didn't answer to position or title. It only answered to me. My phone rang just after 7 p.m. I almost didn't answer. It was a number I didn't recognize, and I'd been trying to enjoy the quiet hum of my apartment for once. But something in me paused. I picked up. Cassandra. The voice was clear, direct. This is Iris Marlowe. I hadn't heard from her directly since the Brussels call 3 months ago. Back then, she was sharp but gracious, the kind of leader who listened before she spoke and remembered who actually did the work. Iris, I said carefully, it's good to hear your voice. There was a pause on her end, not awkward but precise. I wasn't informed you were no longer on the Marlowe file, she said. Your replacement hasn't reached out. In fact, no one has. But we received a final contract version yesterday with format discrepancies, and my legal chief flagged edits we didn't agree to. Approval log doesn't match the version we signed off on. I already knew. The system had flagged the override attempt in real time. I understand, I said. I don't want you to break protocol, she continued, but I need to know, were you aware of these changes? The indemnity clause was shortened. Clause 21 is missing timestamps. I stood near the window, hand resting on the sill, then I answered as plainly as I could. I'm no longer authorized to speak for Carrington, but page 42 still speaks for itself. She caught it. I heard the shift in her breath. The biometric gateway, she said softly. Yes. That clause is still in, I didn't confirm. I didn't need to. I appreciate your time, she said. I'll have my team review the metadata. Quietly. I nodded, even though she couldn't see it. You'll find what you need. The call ended. I let the silence return. Across the street, a man was locking up his flower shop. Light poured out of Carrington's windows on the next block, but not for long. My screen pinged. A new error report from Gateway Final had just been logged, and someone had tried again, this time from a different machine. By noon the next day, the quiet broke. A whisper at first, Jacob forwarded a Slack screenshot from an internal Carrington channel titled "Demi Urgent Legal Mar Fix." The message was red-flagged, time-stamped at 11:03 a.m. Marlowe execution still failing. Langdon attempted override, triggered biometric block again, security looped compliance. CEO has been notified. I read it twice. Then checked my own mirrored logs. The attempt came from a non-compliant device. IP matched a shared terminal in the West conference room. They'd tried to force an authorization request from a clone draft, bypassing the original clause identifiers. It triggered the gateway lockdown instantly. Nothing moved after that. By 1:47 p.m., the first headline hit Carrington deal halted over unknown security lock. Source VentureCivic.com. It wasn't flashy, not yet. But the finance forums were already picking it up, dissecting the language. Unknown lock in a deal that size was blood in the water. An hour later, someone leaked an internal Carrington memo meant only for their legal team. It was short clinical. Our client's counsel has flagged unapproved revisions. Metadata in the current contract does not match the final signed draft. The version we signed off on was Hale's. They used my name, not Cass, not strategic contracts, not legacy contributor. Hale. The document circled fast. I didn't post it. I didn't need to. It was already everywhere. Inside, Carrington Brielle was pulled from her meetings mid-afternoon. Another Slack capture showed someone had disabled her admin access across 3 platforms. She'd become a ghost in the system, one she never understood in the first place. I watched it unfold from a quiet seat near my window, sipping the same kind of tea I'd brought into every late-night strategy session for the past decade. I hadn't spoken publicly. I hadn't written a word, but the clause had. The logs had. The systems built on my discipline were doing exactly what they were designed for, refusing to answer to anyone who hadn't earned the right to touch them. And the clients were watching. He arrived 7 minutes late. Gregory Flint, CEO of Carrington & Flint, walked into the conference room at my attorney's office near Union Square, looking like a man who hadn't slept in 3 days. His shirt collar was creased, and his voice had lost the rehearsed polish I'd heard on 1,000 stages. He didn't offer a smile, just an outstretched hand I didn't take. "Thank you for meeting," he said quietly, settling into the chair across from me. I know things didn't unfold the way they should have. I let the silence stretch until it landed heavy. "You know why I'm here?" I nodded. "You're here because the deal you tried to force without me is now frozen. Because your client doesn't trust the version you handed them. And because your systems are answering to a name you crossed out." He swallowed hard, glanced toward my attorney Miriam, who sat calm and silent beside me. Then he shifted forward. We're prepared to offer a full bonus, he said. 6 figures. We'll reinstate your title. And I'm willing to recommend you for a board appointment, internal or external. I didn't respond. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a thin black folder, slid it across the table. He opened it. Inside was a printed copy of the legacy control exception, signed by Carrington's former CTO 10 months earlier, back when I'd first implemented the biometric clause. It stated plainly that any changes to Gateway Final's execution structure required my written approval and physical presence. No exceptions. No overrides. Gregory's eyes moved down the page. When he reached the final signature, his fingers tensed slightly. I signed this, he said. Not a question, just the stunned confession of a man remembering too late. I met his gaze. You didn't just remove me, Gregory. You tried to overwrite me, and now the foundation is reminding you who built it. He started to speak again, but Miriam raised a hand. There's no negotiation, she said softly. I stood, smoothed my blazer. You wanted a future without me? I said. Now you have it. And I walked out. The press release dropped at 9:17 a.m. Marlowe Group hereby terminates its pending procurement agreement with Carrington and Flint, effective immediately due to unresolved discrepancies in contract authenticity and leadership misalignment. No spin. No soft landing. By noon, Carrington's stock had dropped 7%. The internal memo came an hour later. Brielle Langdon was transitioning out of active projects, pending reassignment. Gregory Flint was placed on immediate leave subject to board review. The word suspended wasn't used, but no one needed it to be. I read all of it from my table at Camden Rowers, the cafe tucked off East 46th, where I'd once taken junior associates for quiet career advice over espresso. This morning, I sat alone by the window, the same black coffee in front of me, no rush in my chest. The final document sat in my inbox, digitally signed, encrypted, and confirmed. A consulting agreement from Marlowe Group. Flexible hours, full discretion, no title, just scope. It wasn't framed as a win. It wasn't meant to be. It was continuity. On my terms. I opened my laptop one last time. A forum post was trending on one of the niche procurement boards I still browsed from habit. Respect to whoever coded that lock. That's how you walk away with power. No name attached, no context, just digital breadcrumbs leading nowhere and everywhere. I didn't comment, didn't even log in, but I read it twice. Across the table, the barista set down another coffee and a small piece of dark chocolate. On the house, she said with a smile, "You look like you just won something." I smiled back, small, grounded, and without performance. Not everything needs to be declared. Not every victory needs a spotlight. Some things are written into the fabric of the work, buried in the structure, humming in the silence of a system that simply refuses to forget who authored it. I took a sip and let the quiet settle. Not like an ending, but like a door finally shut behind me. And beyond it, something else opening.